Hi everyone. With this particular video, I wanted to respond to a short by John the Duncan. He's a leftist on YouTube that I follow. He does a lot of work about post-colonial theory. He talks about neoliberalism and genocide, things like that, in popular media, and critiques of the online left that I find really useful. This particular thing by him is something that he's been doing on TikTok, where he has these short little spicy takes on various subjects. And a lot of the time I agree with him. And in this particular instance, he said Tim Burton's a hack who doesn't understand the basic point of the Addams family. And I'm not one for defending Tim Burton. I just watched a video recently discussing the decline of Tim Burton, the early days when he worked with Disney, and then he broke out and did his own thing, starting with like Batman, Beetlejuice, early films like that, and then films like Big Fish, leading on to a decline later in his career where he started relying a lot more on visual spectacle and sort of posturing as an outsider who's really all about making money and presenting himself as someone who's misunderstood, but point in fact makes a lot of money for big corporations. Not really that different from James Cameron, someone who cut his teeth with movies that started off a bit more politically biting, but at the end of the day were basically neoliberal propaganda disguised as like action narratives. And really just making a shitload of money through derivative projects like Titanic or sexist, xenophobic products like True Lies, Aliens. There's a lot of problems that I have with James Cameron, and you can level the same complaints at someone like Tim Burton. So when I get the vibe that John the Duncan is going for when he's talking about how Tim Burton's a hack, it's like, yeah, by and large, I kind of had written Tim Burton off, and I went into Wednesday with, shall we say, reduced expectations. I had prepared myself for something that wasn't going to be entertaining. Also, full disclaimer, when I say that the show's entertaining, I don't mean that it's necessarily faithful to the original source material. And that's something that I think John the Duncan is really stressing here, that the show, according to him, misses the whole point of the original Addams family. And because it doesn't emulate that, Tim Burton's a hack who doesn't understand the basic point of the original show. I will say that Tim Burton, by and large, these days, is a corporate hack who, even in some of his films, like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, actually had kind of a fascist vibe going on. So there's certainly a lot to say about Tim Burton that I don't agree with. When I was in grad school, one thing I remember reading about in Catherine Spooner's Happy Gothic, for instance, is the idea of Tim Burton as an auteur who shaped the way that the Gothic is viewed in the 21st century, sort of like a postmodern Gothic or something even more recent than postmodernity. When a lot of people think of postmodernity, they actually think of like French philosophers of, say, the 1960s and 70s, people like Foucault and Derrida, Lacan, and then other thinkers as well that came after. But the idea of deconstructing a narrative and doing its own thing, or adapting things in various ways, is a practice that can happen in the here and now. And I was actually kind of leery of someone like Tim Burton coming along and just not being funny, being over-reliant on visual effects, and having narratives that kind of veered away from the Wednesday Addams that I knew from the movies. The Addams Family, and then Addams Family Values, both of which Wednesday was played by Christina Ricci, who returns here. And so when I came into it, I didn't have the nostalgia of the original show, and frankly, that was one of the last things on my mind. But I have studied the Gothic in grad school. It is something that I've had to read about, and there are a lot of tropes here that are brought up in the show. And I guess before I continue, I want to say spoilers because I will be discussing the show, and I guess I'll try not to give too many things away. But at the end of the day, don't watch this if you haven't seen Wednesday yet. Go and watch it. I think it's a perfectly fine show for what it is. Is it the exact same thing as the original show from the 1960s or 70s? I forget when it was made. I didn't watch it, so full transparency here. I haven't seen the original show, but I did grow up on the 90s films, and I thought that was more the tone that they were going for, that Wednesday is a misfit, she stands out, she doesn't really fit in. But the interesting thing here, and something that John the Duncan actually disagreed with, if I pull up sort of the response, where he says, Tim Burton's a hack who doesn't understand the basic point of the Addams family. So I say, as a Marxist and a Gothicist, I think there's a little more going on than that. My guy, Wednesday is removed from her family through a decision about her learning to be social despite her antisocial ace tendencies. I've had to relate and deal with people like her and found her character arc mixed with oodles of classic Gothic tropes to be meaningful and fun. Coming from someone who grew up on the 90s film and early Tim Burton, I honestly thought the new show was a lot of fun and a return to form for Burton. And Duncan replies, the whole point of the Addams family is that they don't have to learn with being antisocial. And why is Wednesday having to learn to be somewhat social intrinsically a bad thing? By the end of the story, she's still very much the same person, same values, personality, and anti-social / introverted style. She just had to change her approach slightly to relate to people outside of her family. Call me crazy, but I liked it. I certainly don't think it's Tim Burton being a hack and going goth and then not having much to say. The narrative was actually surprisingly productive and nuanced, albeit from a classical Gothic standpoint, updated for the 21st century. Sure, it's not for purists, but adaptations frequently aren't. He replies, because it misses the whole point of the Addams family socialization being deliberately off-putting for the rest of the world. Wednesday Addams learning to hug and let people in makes absolutely no sense for the Addams family, and to be honest is a very weak, overwrought storyline already. I basically think the show has zero redeeming features beyond Ortega's performance. And, look, I understand that Wednesday is someone who is being forced to work within society. Like, she's not an outsider in the sense of she has to change what she is to actually get anything done, or at the very least she has to do things to solve the mystery, right? She's the female detective. The trope of the female detective is something that was popular in the early days of Gothic fiction with like Anne Radcliffe in the late 18th century, but also with Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, the Old English Baron, the monk. In the case of the monk, generally you have the female approach to mystery versus the male approach to mystery, which is grab a sword and kick ass and fight demons, shit like that. Whereas the female approach was much more passive, much more grab a candelabra, wander through the dark halls, almost walking around in the dark, feeling terrified. A more 20th century iteration of that would be someone like Velma and Scooby-Doo. Here's what happened, and they sit down and explain the mystery, the explained supernatural, which is a trope introduced by Anne Radcliffe that Hanna-Barbera made famous with their cartoon Scooby-Doo. Velma is explaining away the supernatural elements and getting to the bottom of the mystery. And in order to solve the mystery in Wednesday, the character has to get close to people. Ostensibly close. But here's the thing, she doesn't actually change all that much. You say that socialization is off-putting to the socialization with the Addams family and them being off-putting. Like, she's an off-putting character. That's the whole point. And she's still kind of off-putting, but she has a close circle of friends that she learns to like. So saying like that's somehow betraying her core values, she doesn't really change all that much. Yeah, she learns how to cry, but one thing that I was actually kind of surprised by is that she is still very much the same character. She has a personality where she is confrontational, she speaks her mind, and she doesn't sacrifice that by kissing Tyler, for instance, late in the show. It's an attempt to get close to him and find out what he is. And you could argue that, well, she may have had feelings for him to some extent, and had he not actually been the killer, then maybe things could have changed somewhat. But by and large, she was treating everyone at the school like they were a suspect in a crime scene. And this was true for all of the men in the show. And the one that she felt most close to was the one who was the most awkward, the most social. And I think that her having a degree of empathy, despite being antisocial, introverted, and asexual, because it is an asexual approach to love, where she uses sex as a means to an end, which is furthering the basic human rights of outcasts. She is a freedom fighter of sorts, and she doesn't sacrifice any of that, and she doesn't just turn into a Mary Sue type character. I don't really like the term Mary Sue, but basically someone who's just like, gee whiz gang, I'm really nice, I'm really good, and I'm going to solve the mystery. Like, she is off-putting to other people, and the show spends a large amount of time doing that, and by the end of the show, there are a small number of characters that she's able to kind of bond with. And I'm hoping that as the show progresses, that she doesn't lose that bite to her character, but to say that, it's a very weak, overwrought storyline. Because of that, I think you're kind of overemphasizing the crying and the hugging. Like, she doesn't find love at the end of the story. She makes friends, but she doesn't become overly sexualized. She doesn't fall in love with anyone. And the whole approach to being social in her case is a means of, like, solving a crime. Now, you could argue that Wednesday never did that in the original show, but it was also kind of from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, the original show was largely about how they didn't fit in with the normie weirdos around them. And point in fact, in the show, Wednesday doesn't really fit in with the normie weirdos either. And it's about finding out who the killer is and standing up for people who are generally genocided against, witches, the Salem witch trials, the Native Americans. And she is, in that sense, a female detective who sticks out from everyone else, who kind of owns that role as a means of getting what she wants. And yeah, it's cliche. The Gothic is cliche. And the fatal attraction, the perfidious gentleman caller who's sort of trying to distract her or throw her off the scent with his normie good looks, and he's trying to be charming and present himself as normal as possible. Wednesday sees through that, and she has a poker face that's meant to not just fool Tyler, but everyone else around her, including the audience. And I, for one, thought that was kind of fun. Is it different from the original show? Sure. But from what I understand, Wednesday in the original television show wasn't a detective. And in Wednesday in Addams Family Values was someone who was didn't fit in. They have to be in the happy hut. They have to listen to the sound of music, and they hate it. And they're kind of playing off that when Tyler in the show has Wednesday watch Legally Blonde, and she's like, "Oh, well, that's torture." But you also have to keep in mind the whole point of that scene. The subtext is that she's on to Tyler to some extent. She doesn't fully trust him, and when she says you're making a mistake, it's not entirely because, oh, I'm going to break your heart because I'm antisocial, but because you're a potential suspect, and you getting close to me is actually what leads Tyler to die the ignominious death. In his case, he doesn't die, but the ignominious defeat is him letting his guard down and get close to someone who he knows experiences visions. So him doing that, Wednesday is right. He's making a mistake as her opponent. I thought that was good. I thought it was really well done. Wednesday, or the actress Ortega, she has a very good poker face, and they maintain the act, the Gothic charade, And is it different from the original show? Sure, but I almost feel like you're kind of whinging about that and saying, oh, the show doesn't, the 2022 show by Tim Burton, that just certifies that he's a hack because it misses the point of the original show. Well, if that's the case, no adaptation would work. You could say the same thing about Ridley Scott when he adapted Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep to film, because it's actually a fairly different story than what Philip K. Dick did and his original potboiler sci-fi kind of narrative. And you could argue that it kind of touches on similar things, but it does it in a very different way. And the antisocial tendencies and the Gothic pastiche of the original Addams Family or the movies or what they're doing here, they're still having similar conversations dialogically about these things, but the emphasis is different. It's about what would happen if Wednesday went to a boarding school. And yet it feels less neoliberal than I thought, because again, Wednesday is someone who is not apologizing for the principle, and she's someone who's speaking out against the token black mayor, for instance, who used to be sheriff, who's now the mayor, and he has this situation where he's building this shrine to the pilgrim villain of the show, and Wednesday burns it to the ground in a very, rebellious display, literally burning someone's idol. And I thought, okay, now, again, that's not necessarily something that Wednesday would do as like an active rebel. It's much more contained within the family circle and them just being closed off from everyone else. But as Derrida has said, there is no outside of the text. And in this case, Wednesday learning to be social to the degree that she needs to be a social activist, I thought was something different. And yes, it exists within the tired Gothic tropes, but the Gothic tropes were tired when Horace Walpole dug them out of the ground and reassembled them for his infamous Castle of Otranto, which he passed off as a historical relic that an anonymous person had published, and then he came out a year later for the second edition and said, oh, by the way, it was actually me, and people had a shit fit back then. Oh, it wasn't authentic. Well, authenticity isn't really the point when the Gothic mode is all about reviving the past and doing something different with it. And I thought that Wednesday did that while still being left-leaning and doing it in a more cliche kind of Gothic way, but all's fair in the Gothic mode when it comes to these types of things. Making Wednesday a female detective who is against genocide and neoliberal institutions is totally okay with me, even if it's not, canon. And you could bring that back around to Tim Burton and how much involvement did he have with that? Is he just reinventing things? It's like, whatever, I don't care. It works for what it is, even if it's not, pure or faithful to the original show. It's like nostalgia is not the end-all be-all, and if you want to reinvent something, as long as it has a left-leaning message, which this show does, then great. It's against genocide, it's against cults, it's against abuse of power in various institutions, be those carceral or at boarding schools. And I liked that. It could have leaned a little bit more heavily into some of them, but at the end of the day, this type of story, yeah, they could have made her a complete outcast, someone who's totally asocial. But just compared to Tim Burton and his usual track record this late in his career, I thought this one was a win. And this is coming from someone who, again, I've spent my entire academic career studying these kinds of things, researching these kinds of things. And a lot of it was modular. I wrote my thesis largely on video games, but also the uncanny home in Metroidvania, that kind of thing. But you can apply a lot of those concepts to other things. And, just pointing a finger at Tim Burton and saying, well, he sucks. And it's like, yes, Tim Burton sucks. But this show and him sort of adapting it and taking it in a different direction, I thought it worked. He still sucks. Like Tim Burton, this is like someone who, as far as I'm concerned, I had written off. And yet this isn't exactly this isn't nearly as bad as his latest output, and if anything, I think it's a lot of fun. And you could still say that, you know, a lot of his work is problematic. He's writing this for Netflix. He's still about making money, but at the end of the day, it's still not a bad show for what it is. You know, yeah, it's Gothic pastiche, but what isn't Gothic pastiche? And is it divorced from, you know, the original sort of message that the original show was talking about? Of course, but it's the 21st century, and they're talking about things relative to palimpsests that are a little bit closer to the here and now than the original show even. Like, this is closer to the 90s films, for instance, than it is the original show. And why is that even surprising? And it's not a reason to just dismiss everything outright, you know, at least as far as I'm concerned. You might feel differently about it, but in any event, I think I've said enough about this. And this isn't a dig at John the Duncan. I like a lot of his stuff, but his total dismissal of the show based on the fact that he obviously doesn't like Tim Burton is a little short-sighted, given that there's actually quite a bit of left-leaning stuff going on that, while far from perfect, like, you know, they always could be more rebellious. I think for Netflix and what they normally put out through that particular channel, you know, I think it's actually pretty surprising, especially from someone like Tim Burton. So hate on Tim Burton if you want, but honestly, I thought the show was great, and not just because of the performance of the actress playing Wednesday. You know, the visuals were good. It was the right amount of violence, and not leaning too hard into the sexuality of the character or the social nature of the character. You know, it's like the crux of the drama is about her learning to be just social enough to be an effective detective, and to learn from that while not really changing her basic self, I think. And that's kind of what college is like. I was antisocial too, and then when I went to school, I made friends, but I didn't really change who I was fundamentally. If anything, it only radicalized me further. So I think that, you know, with the second season of Wednesday, I'm pretty curious to see if something similar happens. She'll make a few close, lifelong friends. You can still be introverted and antisocial and have one or two friends. You know, I would actually be kind of alienating if she just hung around family all the time and didn't have any friends outside of her family circle. And even in the 90s films, they kind of broke away from that. You know, her going to this camp, this summer camp, and making a friend, bringing him back home and then torturing him. Yeah, okay, I get it. But that's kind of what she was doing in the show, too. And good. Awesome. Anyways, something a little bit different, but there you go. Those are my thoughts on the show. Tim Burton sucks. John the Duncan's pretty cool guy. I love what he says about genocide, and you know, post-colonial theory more generally, his critique of neoliberalism is pretty eye-opening. But his take on Gothic stuff, kind of, well, he sounds like a purist who's unhappy. And it's like, okay, fine, but that's not really what I would call valid criticism in and of itself. Like, you have to do a little bit more than that. Like, what is the show actually doing? And to dismiss it outright just feels kind of empty. But that's just my opinion. Anyways, guys, thanks for listening, and take care.